Hello, thanks for coming, and there's a lot of people online. So we're going to hear from Dr. Fraser. He's a professor of agricultural and environmental economics at the University of Kent in the UK. He did his PhD in Manchester, like some other people, and he has had part of his career in Australia, which is quite good. He has been
the better part, yeah.
The best part, yeah. He has been advisor for policymakers in very important projects. They're here in his bio. He's also the editor of 3 journals.
I'm only the editor currently of 1.
But on the other ones, you're a little bit of an editor.
A little bit.
Yeah, like associate editor counts as editor.
Okay.
Yeah. And he has a broad range of research interests besides what he presented last week and this week. Okay, so the floor is yours for
Thank you.
40 minutes only. And then
Right.
David Pine is going to take care of the questions because I have to teach.
That's okay, that's fine. Yeah, there won't be any questions because it'll be just, yeah. Right, so thank you. Yes, right. So, yeah, been all through this before, haven't we? So this is work with Kelvin, who I do lots of work with, and who's worked with Dan in the past and with Michael actually as well. And one of Kelvin's colleagues, Daniele, who's probably more a sort of a food technology type, but he does lots of sort of, stated preference research. And as many academic papers, it's got a particularly exciting title about choice experiments, and it's to do with basically how we get the information, and then there's aspects of what we then do with it and what we might be able to get from it. So just try to crack on with these. So yeah, what we're doing is we are thinking about what information is revealed when you ask the choice task. There is this potential link between whether we think what we're getting is really the full set of information or whether the information set is incomplete. And if it is essentially incomplete, then how do you try to sort of manage that in terms of what you're estimating? So how do you try and take account of it? And so we have got one set of data where we've gone through with these methods already. So we've got results on that. We have a second survey going out, which will also use these methods. And I think we're sort of taking the view, which is sometimes, when you're doing something new, having 2 sets of data might be better, because at the moment, one set of results is fine, but you could just say, well, what you're getting is just the way you've designed it, and there's nothing particularly exciting. So anyway, you're going to see the first set because the other set, as I say, is still waiting to be collected. So yeah, it's stated preference, it's choice experiments, which I think a lot of you are doing. What actually has sort of come to our attention and as a result of doing this stuff is that if you could actually ask somebody to give you a probability as opposed to simply a yes or a no, in terms of what would be the probability of selecting something, you actually get more information. And that would actually mean that you get a better characterization of actually how they're thinking about the choice task. All right, so you don't just say, would I like to take A or B? It's like, what is the probability of selecting A or B? And it doesn't have to be 100 and 0, it could be 75, 25, all right? Because it could reflect some way in which you're thinking about the choices on offer. It also doesn't have to be binary. It could be that you could look at, you could have several, maybe 3 or 4 options in your choice set, but most of the work done today is done with just binary. It doesn't have to be, but that's what it's been done with. So this is really what we're considering. Now there is an antecedent literature, like all things I frequently have done with Kelvin, and I say Dan will bear testament to this. We hadn't read the literature, and we started then reading the literature, and we then stumbled onto what appears to be quite an important literature. So we're not doing the same as that, exactly the same, but there is effectively like a fairly important lineage in terms of things that relate to what we're doing, which I think is interesting anyway, because it sort of sits out in the margins of the choice literatures, and it might be something that people might want to investigate anyway, even if you don't buy into what we're doing here. So what we've got is a couple of food choice experiments. One is about dried apples. I find very exciting. The second one's about fish fingers, grabbing your attention because I know you're both into dried apples and fish fingers. The The Apple one is because there's a new processing technology, so that's why it's been done hypothetically. With the Plymouth fish finger, it's all about the fact that these fish fingers are going to be made from what would typically be discarded, or basically the bycatch, which would typically not be used. It's also going to be co-produced in the locality, whatever that means, but that's what we put on the choice sets. And it's going to be locally made and branded. And so you're interested there about the locality of the food and all the things that that might bring with it. And that's part of a much bigger research project on empowering local communities to think about food design, food choice, which is, you know, quite a sort of a big movement, certainly in the UK. I suspect it is here as well. So we're trying to basically work out the extent to which, as it says, inclusion or exclusion of particular attributes might influence choice, conventional stuff. Just on the air drying stuff, the apples, basically what you've got is conventional air drying, and then you've got this thing called vacuum impregnation and air drying. It came up when I presented this in Adelaide, because what we will see as the results are people don't tend to like the name, they don't like the technology. And what actually, and I hadn't designed this particular experiment, Daniele had, maybe the word impregnation maybe doesn't sort of ring or hit home that well with maybe people looking at it as a technology. It sounds a bit, so anyway, but you'll see the results. But what you basically do is you dry it, and actually in the process here, you can actually add in fibre. And as we were discussing in the sort of the food health type work or piece I did previously, you know, we're all getting to the age where a bit more fibre in our diets probably isn't a bad thing. So let's get into DCEs and probability elicitation. So the existing literature, the key paper really that sort of places this nicely in context. It's a nice, easy paper to read, actually. It's in the International Economic Review, so it's in a sort of a very well-established sort of core econ journal. The first named author is Blast, but Mansky, who does lots of research in sort of limited dependent, so big name in this world. They basically had this paper where they talk about probabilities and why we might want to elicit them. So if you really want to get into this stuff within that context, the paper by Blast is the one to go to. And then the subsequent papers like Pedersen, Scarpa, Pedersen's a Scarpa publication as well. The more recent paper by Consar is a labour economics application in the Journal of Econometrics. There are papers out there, but it's not done very often, this approach. But it's, I think, probably in a sense underutilized. So I think the reason why it's probably being little used is because people struggle to frame and think about making choices with probabilities. That's quite a hard thing to ask people to do. You get clarities, you know, when zeros and ones, but otherwise it might be sort of seen as being fuzzy. And, you know, in a sense, what you really then need to be doing with your estimation is trying to, if you like, take account of the fuzziness when it's not 0 and 1. So that's the challenge. But if you can get people to give you probabilities, again, going back to these papers here, you get basically more bang for your buck in terms of what they're giving you, in terms of what you can then get out of it with your estimation. So, yeah, not sure why it hasn't taken off, not sure why it's not been maybe more widely employed. Maybe like a lot of these things, you know, just because everybody has historically done, would you select A or B or C? That's what we all do. We just go down and write the choice task out and say, we'll do A, B or C. You know, we just tend to sort of follow a little bit, maybe without stepping back at times. So this is the sort of stuff that they've done, where so the first task is this one at the top. It doesn't really matter, you can't see the attributes, but it's A or B. And what they do is they have a sliding scale. Now they do this because it makes the allocation of the probabilities easier, because all you do is you slide across and then you allocate it. This one down here, this is to do with power generation. Again, it's binary, there's no opt-out, A and B, and then you basically get your probabilities here. They will almost certainly have had underlying this a constraint to say they have to add up to 100. But in some ways, actually, not having that constraint in there would actually be even more revealing about whether people really understand probabilities, but put that aside. So that's what's been done. And you can then, with this data, you can follow the econometrics that's in the Blast paper, whereby you end up getting a log odds ratio because you've got probabilities. You can then basically, as a result of that, use a least absolute deviation estimator, so you can linearize it. And all you then got to worry about is when you've got 1 over 0 or 0 over 1, clearly that's not defined. So you have to have a little tremor just to bring the numbers away from those extremes because you can't estimate them. And yeah, it's quite neat. The least absolute deviation estimator effectively buys you some ability to not worry about those extreme values because of the way it works. So it can be done quite simply, actually. Once you get this data, you can estimate it with the existing approach quite easily. As I say, not been massively used. If you go, of course, to 3, you can't then have a ratio of the 2. You can try to, for example, then have some sort of fractional logit type approach. Rick Scarpa's got a paper where he's done that. The only problem is there's a paper come out recently from some guys at the University of Loughborough and places where they've pointed out that theoretically that's probably not going to give you consistent estimates. So there still are some issues if you have more than the binary and you've got the probabilities and how you deal with them. But this is out there, been done a little bit, and as I said, but really, really only small amounts. What we are doing, and I'll show you this straight up, I'm not going to really go into the gory depths of the detail of the theory, partly because, yeah, it would be here for hours, and I've got, what, probably 30 minutes now at most. But we are just looking at the Apple example. So you've got just, you know, classic mock-up of a product, and the way it works is we have 2 alternative ways of framing the question, all right? And this is the elicitation part. So this one, which we're going to refer to as subjective logic, and that relates partly to the theory that sits behind this. You distribute 100 points among the following statements to reflect your likelihood of purchasing options A or B if you had to buy either A or B. And what you do is by allocating more points from the 100 to A or B, you're reflecting a stronger preference. Equally, and this again is slightly where it differs to the existing probability stuff, you can also allocate to, I'm uncertain as to the likelihood of buying. So this effectively is sort of picking up your no choice, or because that's effectively what the no choice often picks up, or the status quo when you're offering this in a choice context. I think, you know, it has a slightly ambiguous meaning, but that's how it's seen here. So this is, we were talking about it yesterday, Curtis, that this isn't really, in a sense, going into the supermarket 100 times, but it's saying, imagine I had to sort of go in and sort of express my view about A or B, and I wasn't absolutely certain about A or B. So, yes, it is, but what you're doing is you're capturing some aspect of the uncertainty around your. So when we go to the 0-1, we're saying we're absolutely certain. This is allowing you to express some of the uncertainty you might have. Dan, you've got a question.
Just about that question.
Yeah, go for it.
So, I mean, one way of saying I'm uncertain is that it's 50-50.
Yeah.
So I'd say I'll give 50 to A and 50 to B, and that's like a toss of a coin. Half the time I go in, I'd buy A. Half the time I'd go in.
But you would definitely buy A or B.
So I'm just curious about the difference between that and saying I'm uncertain about the likelihood.
So this one is saying I'm uncertain about whether I'd buy it or not. If you went 50-50, you're saying I would buy it, but I don't know whether I'd basically buy A or B. That's a different form of, you definitely are going to get it. This is saying I'm not sure I'm going to buy it at all.
But not worded that way.
No, but that's how we've interpreted it. Yeah, I know. Yeah. When this was designed, this was shown to the guy who's the sort of the subjective logic guru, and we sort of said, do you think this line aligns with what you consider to be subjective logic? And the guy said yes. By the way, you can have the slides if you want. You don't have to take a photo. No, that's all right. You're fine. So, but yeah, that's the way we have framed it. Now, I'm not going to stand here and say it has to be done this way every time like this with these words. But I think all it does is it suggests you could frame the choice task and ask for the information, the elicitation, in a different way. And I think maybe that's really what this is about. It's more about just challenging how we conventionally ask the question.
The other one's clearer.
Yeah.
You push it through a focus group and ask people afterwards.
Yeah, we did sort of look at it. I mean, what you're going to find is when we actually get to the data and the results, we get almost identical mean estimates out, regardless of whether we do it this way or where we have it with a conventional choice experiment approach. Now, whether that means they've almost essentially just treated this as being a certain choice and they've ignored this and just, that's why we want to do a second data set. But yeah, I mean, people understood what we were asking them to do. This has actually got more, this is sort of starting to take you more towards where you might frame some of the stuff when you do risk experiments. But people understood what we were asking them to do. and that came through. So in a sense, we didn't get any red flags at that point of setting it up. But as I say, I'm not wedded to the set of words entirely as they have to be this way. You know, we could change them as long as we kept them aligned with what we consider to be subjective logic. Yeah, go for it.
I just wanted to expand on what on the strength of the preferences.
Yeah.
Like the fact that you're more likely to choose something, not tell you how much you like or dislike the other option. You know what I mean? Like if I go to a supermarket, I will always go for the plain chips, not the salt and vinegar. But my dislike for, I don't mind. I will always go for that one, but the barbecue ones I just hate. I don't know. But so the probability of choice will always be the same, 1 and 0. But that doesn't tell you how much I like one.
No, entirely. I know what you mean. I mean, all we're trying to, again, if you just go for the 0-1 option in this conventional standard approach.
Well, I'll give you like 100 and 0.
Yeah, you can do.
I know the one that I'm going to choose.
Yes.
That doesn't tell you. It's not that I like the plain ones 100 times or infinite times. You know what I mean?
I do know.
If you gave me like barbecue and plain, I would also go 100-0. But
yeah.
I really don't. I wonder what the probability reflects the preference of choice, of whether you could get to something like that with a best worst scaling.
No, yeah, okay. I know what you mean. Right now, I don't know how to answer that, if I'm honest. I can't think it.
Maybe we'll have a look at the results.
Yeah. The results aren't very exciting, actually. So I can stop talking now. Yeah. Go on. Go here, then I'll go there. Yeah, go on.
So why you have option C on the right-hand side or answer C on the right-hand side?
Yeah.
Why is that not added to the left? So basically, you have I'm going to buy A, I'm going to buy B. I don't know if I'm going to buy it all, or I don't know which I'm going to.
This one is what we're referring to as a binomial, all right? So what we do here is we are doing something here which is much more akin to, this is like imagining you've got 20 Bernoulli trials. This is the way to think about this one. And the reason why it's 20 and it's 100 is actually, this comes down to some of the estimation we do in the background too. We can effectively, what you get with this data, we have to effectively go through a process when we actually collect the data to make it equivalent to this. But we can equally convert this into this data, so we can actually compare the degree to which the two approaches are revealing any degree of uncertainty that we might have, because that's what we're going to get to in terms of the attributes and the choice.
I guess I'm just wondering with the left one,
yeah.
You've got A, you've got B, you've got uncertainty, and I guess where is neither? You have A, you have B, you have neither on the right. And
yeah.
Left, you have A, B.
And that's.
And I guess where does neither versus uncertainty kind of bridge the gap between these two? That's what I'm struggling with now.
I don't actually, off the top of the head, I don't really know in that sense. I don't know how to answer that because
I guess that my question is, can you not have both of those as response categories in the left-hand side to make it, or, and if you don't have to answer that either, I'm just curious.
This
in my head right now.
Well, in the sense, this goes back to so without sort of getting into the gory details, it's in some of it's in the slides, and there's a paper which eventually will be neat enough to share with people. But when you actually characterize something using this theory, subjective logic, you effectively, this captures how that is framed. Whereas this is really just capturing much more sort of a conventional probabilistic choice. Yeah. So in a sense, we have to have it almost this way, given the way that theory works. Whether there's something where we could blend them, is that what you're saying? I don't know. But it's.
I don't know either.
No, but all I think.
I'm just wondering if all the bases aren't covered in the left one, or is uncertainty being covered by A and B, and C is I would pick neither, or is that's I guess what I'm struggling with right now, but you don't have to answer it. It's just a comment.
They feel different, don't they?
Yeah, I don't know what it means. Either.
Yeah.
So that's all.
I reckon we've even now.
Exactly.
No, but actually in some ways this is partly why this is important, because there's nothing that goes on behind all of this in terms of both the theory and then basically what we have to do with the data to estimate it that makes any sense unless you buy into the actual framing of the question. Because, if you put this in front of an audience and they don't like it or they don't engage with it, then it's a waste of time on some level. But equally, I'm of the view which is by just attempting to reframe and trying to think about how you get more information out, and moving away from what we might consider to be the status quo way of doing these things, we might find there might be alternative ways that might possibly tell us more. I'm not suggesting it's this, but we seem to have sort of got very stuck.
Given that you re-encourage us, right? I hate dried apple.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm not.
I'll get to you in a second.
Oh, so sorry.
There was one at the back here.
We are 7 minutes behind now with this exchange, so maybe we're
No,
gonna.
No, just no. So Dan doesn't like dried apples. We're clear on that. What about fish feet?
I'm not
Yeah.
likely to buy A. I'm not likely to buy B. I'm not uncertain about my likelihood of buying A. B. I am certain.
Okay.
But I don't want to buy either.
Which is actually what you're getting at here. No, I agree. Okay. I understand.
Let's leave that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
No,
You
let's keep going. Any questions?
Okay. When I really stumble.
We're gonna go straight to the end now. We have been discussing for 7 minutes already.
But I think this is the bit which I think is worth discussing. This is partly why I put it on in early, because otherwise what happens, I go through all the gory stuff and you're thinking I'll get to the chase. And yeah.
You had put a word there which is not probability but possibility, and I think in bad literature they have something called possibility theory. So what we are looking at is the possibility. It's not a likelihood, but it is how can I define it? It is your confidence that maybe if you're given this range, then you're likely to choose that. That is the possibility rather than probabilistic. And I'm just struggling because when you probability, then I take it different from a possibility. Possibility that it's not necessarily a likelihood, but it simply means that there's a possibility that given this choice, then this is the choice they're going to make. And I think from the fuzzy choice theory, then what you're going to do is that you're going to think about the membership function, the degree of belongingness to that level of possibility. And so when you come to model that, you'll be modeling it looking at what is the degree of membership. I think they talk about the degree of membership to the range that you are having, and that is what is going to help you then to develop kind of like the way you think of a possibility distribution. So you're going to come up with a distribution, but that distribution is not necessarily probabilistic, it's possibilistic.
Yeah, I mean, that might be more akin to what we think about when we talk about ambiguity. That strikes us. But I understand what you mean a bit about fuzzy theory. We don't really, that doesn't come into this, but it might. I am not going to suggest it's not aligned to it or has some relation to it, but it's not the way we are thinking about it. But the subjective logic, well, I'll show you a figure. I'm not going to go through it. We'll get to it, hopefully. I know, I've got to get on. So, yeah. I mean, basically, the key bit in the BLAST paper is when scenarios are incomplete, stated choices cannot be made, cannot be more than the point predictions of actual choices. And what that's basically getting at is really, if there's anything that's going on in your sets of information and there's incompleteness, really what you're getting at is either the 0 or the 1. You get nothing in between, and that's why getting probabilities is more informative. So we've just got a very simple example here about apples and oranges, and unless you give everybody every aspect about the particular commodity you're purchasing, as in this case, then something is going to be missing. And as a result of that, especially when it's hypothetical, you are typically then as an individual facing these tasks, you're solving it without full information or a complete information set. And as a result of that, that's where the uncertainty might arise and where the issues come from. So that's why, in a sense, it's relevant, because we can never, in a hypothetical sense, give everybody all information. So that's maybe why there's a reason why we might want to follow this route. Right. So it's reframing the task. I don't think let's move on from that bit because we've talked about that. So the contributions about task. There's also econometric stuff going on the background here, which I won't really bore you with, other than to say, when you collect the data with these two elicitation methods, you have to do some stuff in the background with the data to make it estimatable in a way that you can do in a conventional sort of hierarchical Bayesian, or if you like, mixed logic random parameter world. So there is stuff going on in the background, which I'm not going to go into because, as I say, I've now got 20 minutes. Subjective logic, just quickly, which comes back to the sort of the points being made out there. What you really have with subjective logic is you have logic and probability, so you get probabilistic logic, and then you get the uncertainty bit, and then you end up here. This guy whose name's at the top here, Zhou, he's the big name in this world. This stuff is really important in sort of information theory and in sort of the stuff that goes on in the background, actually behind a lot of AI as well, apparently. It seems to have hardly penetrated economics as a way of conceiving of probability and uncertainty. It's interesting, and we'd sort of got to it for something entirely different, because we have a paper where we're thinking about two individuals exchanging information, and they're both Bayesians, and how does that work and how you frame that. And then we stumbled into this, and then we thought, oh, we might be able to use that in a choice experiment. So that's why we've come into this area. I'm not going to say any more about it, other than if you're interested, go find Zhou. His book, which that 2016 publication is free online, and you can fill your boots in your own time. So what we do is we take a standard random utility model. So this is the underlying bit of, there's a bit of theory. We've got a conceptual framework. It's no theory per se at the moment, although we might have to maybe make it more robust if we really want to push it. But what we end up suggesting is, typically in a utility specification, when we're thinking about a choice task, you have the deterministic part and the error structure. So you've got utility, deterministic, error. What actually goes on, and again, the BLAS and the work we're doing here would suggest what we've often thought as being the deterministic part has almost certainly still got some uncertainty associated with it, because it's not a complete set of information. So what it means then, in very sort of simple terms, is you end up with a second source of error in the model, as we would conceive of it. You have deterministic, the issue around the deterministic part, the sort of uncertainty, and then the conventional gumball error, if we're using logit. So then what we have in this sort of new modeling framework is a need to deal with these two error terms. Now, what's done in this particular paper so far, and what we've done is you can bring those error elements together, and you can then effectively make them in aggregate be gumball, which then allows you to estimate logit. So again, there's a explanation of that in the paper. Again, whether you think that is worthwhile doing really hangs on whether you think doing the choice tasks in this type of way is worthwhile. So that's what we've got going on. This bit about it being a second order probability comes from the fact that the way in which it works through in terms of the formal sort of characterization. And it also then turns out then you end up with a probability distribution which you don't know what the distribution should be. So if you want to characterize an unknown distribution, one of the simple tricks is you just call it a beta. So a beta distribution allows you to effectively get lots of different shapes out. It also turns out to be very sort of convenient that a lot of the theory in subjective logic uses beta distributions as well. So there's all this stuff going on underneath in this work which sort of aligns nicely, all right, in terms of some of the probability theory and some of the modeling. So again, without making a big deal of it, if you don't buy into the idea that you can effectively consider there to be a sort of a level of uncertainty, noise, or whatever you want to call it, in the deterministic part as we normally conceive of it, then you won't buy into what we're doing. So again, what we are trying to claim is by framing the tasks in the way we are, we're getting at that information. And if we think we're revealing it, we then have to make this modification to the estimation process. So that's the steps involved conceptually. Yeah, you can, be the judge of that. Yeah, we talk about it in terms of consideration sets. I'm aware of the time. I think I might just jump straight past this stuff. Second order probabilities, I'm going to jump past that because that's probably too much detail right now. Yeah, I'll show you. Here's an equation, just because I've got one in the slides, you may as well see it. But what it comes down to is you end up with what we can end up viewing it as being it is a binary choice here. And so you end up with binomials, which you can then sort of think of as being the probability of A and B like that in a conventional way. And there's nothing stopping you then estimating that with logit as well. Assume we've done all the stuff in the background. And then there's nothing stopping you doing it where you estimate it in willingness to pay space, where you basically just bring in this case, the price parameter out and just do the standard willingness to pay space stuff. So there's a lot between the framing of the task and getting to that step, which I'm not going into. But I think if you are at all interested in the way you frame the task, the information you get from it, and you want to see how it works through, then you will have to read the gory details. All right. But it's probably not something to go into in detail in 40 minutes, which is now probably 10 minutes. Am I about right? Yeah. Okay. I'll get to the experiment, show you it, and then we can open the floor again about the whole task elicitation activity. So the food design problem that we have with the apples is there's a process, talk about carbon footprint, because that's what you do, a bit about fiber, sensory characteristics, because again, it's a food product. You might like it, it's crispy, you might like to eat it, some of you may not. And then you have price range. The survey was done online, and it was, recruited using quota, using basically a list broker, and basically you had to be over a particular age, you had to buy dried fruit, randomization to the treatments. Don't have the data here, but across the treatments, and there are going to be 4, we have pretty much equal numbers. And in terms of the characteristics of the participants across the treatments, they're all fairly even, all right? So there's nothing in the sampling and the way it's worked through in terms of people being dropped into each of the groups across the survey versions that should lead to any difference in results. So that's just, the sort of thing you want to just tick off. So the treatments are standard choice experiment where you don't allow an opt-out, just a forced choice, why not? Subjective logic, binomial, and we've got sort of between 337 and 365, so reasonably big samples, big enough, we would say. Okay. So I don't know why I put this in, but yeah, the bottom line is we've got the conventional, and then we have these 2 new approaches which are based on those 2 questions you saw. The bit that goes on in the background methodologically and econometrically is the data from the binomial can actually be translated into an equivalent form for the subjective logic, and that then can also be converted back to that. And that means with these 2 approaches, we can sort of see whether we're going to get the same degree of understanding about uncertainty as the respondents are expressing it in terms of the task and the attributes. That was done for a particular reason, and we have to then set up the way that sort of works through. But it is quite useful because it means that you can get more information out. You don't actually have to go to that elicitation task, which was the one that was maybe causing 1 or 2 questions. If you preferred the binomial, you can still get the same information out. So you've seen that. Don't want to see it again, do you? No.
You can only see it. No questions until the end of this.
And there you see that one again, if you would, So yeah. Right. So we've got results. Let's just quickly go through. So we've got some. We generate these triangles across the different. So these are. We'll only show you these for the subjective logic and the binomial. That's what SL and BN means. Basically, these describe the way in which people load on to a particular choice. So what you've got on the x-axis here is basically, the likelihood of choosing or not. And the more you go towards the 100, the more certain you are. And what this is picking up, and what these are 5 of the choice cards across the whole set. And the price difference is the price difference on the card, just to see if there's any big issue there. But what we're seeing is typically the bigger the circle on the card at 100 or at 0, effectively the people who've gone 100 0 0 or 0 100 0. So a lot of the time, the vast majority of respondents have gone effectively 0 100 0 or 100 0 0. Now they may have done that simply because they thought that's just the quickest way to do the task, or they may have because they think when it comes to a food choice and I've seen the attributes, I understand them, I am fairly certain in my choice, and therefore I don't feel the need to express any uncertainty as the way it's framed.
So my pen is coming. I know what I want.
Exactly. And I think this doesn't rule out that happening. So Michael then asked me a question earlier, which sort of left me sort of struggling and flapping a bit. But basically he was saying, so you do this, can you then discern the difference between this approach and a standard choice experiment? In a sense, what are you getting at information wise? We've got some results here, I'll show you in a second, where you can see the difference between the respondent behavior. But I think at the moment, I need to go back and talk about this with Kelvin. There may well be a way to actually get a measure out from the data as to the level of uncertainty being captured by the different elicitation methods, which would be useful. So as opposed to just looking at the results in means and the like, if we get a measure out which actually reflects the differences in the way the models have been estimated and the difference at that point. But this tells you anyway, at least as far as this task goes, most of the decision makers are not really showing or expressing a great deal of uncertainty. And it might be down to the task. And that was something that we started discussing when I did this in Adelaide. People in Adelaide said, if you did this and you did it with biodiversity, it might be different. With food, where you've got fairly sort of, tightly specified attributes, and most people have bought food at some point in their lives, I'm sure you have, you have a much clearer understanding, whereas biodiversity can be quite amorphous and really difficult to define. So we're sort of wondering whether, in a sense, doing this with food choice as a way to sort of show it is necessarily going to really reveal what it can tell you, as opposed to doing it maybe in a choice setting where, there's more, if you like, just difficulty with expressing the task to the respondents, and then they might want to express more uncertainty. So I don't know. That's one thing that came up. That does, of course, then raise questions about whether the elicitation format makes sense in that context, which goes back to a conversation I had with Curtis yesterday, and I think that I'm still sort of chewing on that one. This was the one that had Lynn Crace in Adelaide laughing. He said, you've gone to all of that trouble, Ian, and look at those results. They're almost identical across all your treatments. He didn't say it was a waste of time, but, he may as well have said, but it was, it's fair comment. The bit here that's relevant in terms of the product is the fact that, the process is considered not liked. And that was going back to this comment about the word impregnation, people not liking that, which could be the case. But everything else, most of the estimates and essentially the signals or the standard deviations around everything, they are all pretty much, common across the methods. So you could take that as either saying, well, it makes no difference how you frame the task, you get the same information and results out. Is that good? Maybe. Or it could be, in a sense, this might be the sort of task where you don't really need to worry about uncertainty and the ambiguity around the whole sort of task process, which then raises the question, going back to if we did it in another context with another data set, would we get this? So that's what we've got there. These estimates of willingness to pay are also not out of the ballpark in terms of the actual value of the product as it would be sold as well. So we're not sort of struggling from that very inflated value of the attributes, which can happen in choice experiments. You see a lot of the time, you might like the rank order of the estimates, but the numbers are very large, so you sort of get a bit worried about them. That's not the case here, thankfully. What we did do, though, just to sort of show you finally some differences, we did box and whisker plots at the individual level. So these are box and whiskers for the conventional choice experiment methods or task elicitation approaches. So you've got the boxes in the middle, you've got, spread around that as always and across the attributes. If you compare that to the ones where you've got the subjective logic and binomial, all of a sudden you start to see much bigger variation. And I think, although on average, in terms of the mean estimates, you're getting something which is, reasonably the same, you are seeing here more ability for the respondents to express a degree of uncertainty through the way it's framed, and that's where this is now being picked up in the estimation. So then the question becomes, do we think this is relevant additional information? It might be, all right? It might be useful. It might be useful, for example, at the stage when you are doing piloting and you're worried about whether somebody's engaging with your instrument as you anticipate, and maybe they're not getting it. And this might be a way of saying, if we look at trying to get people to think about our choice task and we give them this option and we see huge amounts of this coming out of the data, is that telling us that we've got to be very circumspect? It's a little bit like the way I've sort of come to think about eye tracking, which I've done lots of, which is I tend to think that eye tracking sounds great. You get lots of data, huge amounts of noise. But in many ways, if you really are worried about people looking at your survey and the way you've designed it, you should probably do the eye tracking at the pilot design stage to make sure that, in fact, the way you've designed it is the way then the people will actually look at it, not almost leaving it to the point when you do it for real. Because at that point, if they don't look at it the way you've considered it, you can't basically, you can't correct it. So I think this might be the same sort. This might have the same possible sort of benefit, but as I say, there's nice in the sense we get equivalence across the methods on some level, and it's nice that we get some variation at this level, at the individual level. But I certainly would task to see whether we get anything akin to it again, and I also think doing it in a context which isn't food is also quite relevant. And as I say, ironically, the reason why we do lots of work in food is because you remove that level of uncertainty around often working with, problems which typically which you deal with when you're dealing, natural resources, because often that is more difficult to frame in this world. So you never quite know whether the results you're getting are method or problem, and then those who are filling out the survey, whether they can really truly engage with it because of the difficulty of understanding, some of the constructs. So that's what we've got. Yeah. Well, that's my last slide. I won't bother, that's I've sort of said most of that. I should say the funding came out of a load of funding. The Apple one is funded out of an EU project, which Danny Ellie had. And the fish finger one we'll get to is funded out of this project. This is a mega project, this one. This is like a $10-12 million project. And I mean, one of the things we're trying to do in this project, just as an aside, we've actually been looking at crisps and snacks, and they picked the flavour they picked. Which flavour don't you like? And I said, why are you picking barbecue? Yeah. And they did. But this project's in some ways absolutely trying to basically get local people involved in producing healthy food. And I think to myself, there's a thing called the food industry that accounts for about 10% of national GDP in lots of developed economies, and we're going to give some researchers in a university millions of pounds to try to come up with a new food product. And I sort of thought, is that the best use of research money? I mean, I'm happy to take some of it, but at the same time, you do question. Anyway, yeah, I'm done. So yeah, open for questions.
Well, speaking of food products, there's snacks upstairs and soft drinks that you can go after the seminar. And now I will leave to Dave Pano to handle the Q&A. Thank you very much for your presentation.
That's all right. Welcome.
Okay. Questions, or have we exhausted our?
So that's what we're going to do, by the way. This is what we'll do with the fish fingers. I've taken out all the blurb around it, but that's the task, which again is the allocation of the points. That's the sort of that's how we're going to frame it there. We haven't gone with a mock-up because we thought, as soon as you start mocking up a product which is hypothetical, the actual mock itself, the mock image, can sway people. So we just wanted to keep it and equally because some of those attributes in that task are quite co-created, underutilized, sustainably caught, we're hoping that these will be a little bit more they might create more uncertainty. Still don't quite know what co-created means, but anyway. Yeah, anyway, any questions, anyone?
So, a couple of things. That was very interesting. I was hoping, could you do the equivalent of your triangle plot when you were comparing at the end with your box plot? You can estimate for each individual from the mixed logit their choice probabilities.
Yeah.
So you've got the equivalent of their probabilities. So you can do a straight comparison of your triangle plot, which you've done between SL and BM, but you could also do that for the standard model and see a comparison on that.
They would load onto the 1 and the 0, though, onto the 0 and the 1.
We get a choice probability.
True.
You can simulate after a mixed logit any choice task. What's based on just on their discrete choices, what their choice probabilities are.
Yeah, okay.
So I think comparing the simulated choice probability from a standard DCE versus the choice probabilities that people are giving you would be another level of comparison.
Yeah. Okay.
A suggestion would be, I agree with you about the certainty things, so biodiversity or whatever, but rather than fishing around for domains in which this might pay off more or get more difference, you could simulate it, could you, and say, well, what are the circumstances in which, what are my data generation processes which would lead to significant differences? Because then at least you have an idea about what they would be, which might guide you as to your choice of case study, but it would inform like where these, given your empirical results, simulation related to sort of highlight, well, you could see a big difference in, for example, this scenario where this is people's preference structure or data generating process.
Yeah.
So yeah.
No, I think that's, I agree. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Thank you for a great talk. Interesting. I can't profess to understand all of it, but something just was occurring to me. I think it was along the lines of what Dan was saying. So, if you've got similar results, could that mean that basically could you use this information in experimental design to use probability, your method, to actually use a smaller sample, whereas the binomial method, to get that same result, you would need to have a much larger sample. And so you could actually use this, the fact that it's all the results the same, to reduce your cost of a binomial experiment where you reduce the sample size.
Yeah, so that's the same. That's a sort of an argument along the same sort of lines as the sort of the Scarpa Rose et al. Design idea, whereby you design it and then you do the Bayesian second step and you get the squashed experiment. Yeah, maybe. I'm absolutely. We haven't. This is the second time we've presented it. We hadn't got very much further than just simply thinking about the design, and so you're. Yeah, and so again, I'm absolutely open to suggestions because you know what it's like when you do something, you see it through a very narrow lens to begin with, and you haven't sort of really thought about it, and all you're doing is just throwing out suggestions, and I don't know the answer. It could well be the case. So yeah, maybe that could be an issue around. Again, I'd sort of see it in the context of design, maybe, but you're right. Could you have a smaller sample because of what you're getting? Yeah,
It seems to me you're kind of just you're using a smaller sample set to generate what you would otherwise get on a larger one. And so the fact that your results are all the same could actually confirm that.
Yeah, okay.
Maybe the same as asking a hypothetical question.
I'll go with Herman first because he's got a lease there.
Yeah, this is not the most important question on your presentation, but you mentioned a utility model that you chose. And with so many deviations of the standard utility model as an economist, what's your advice for choosing a utility model without cherry picking? How do you go about, not only in this paper, in different papers, how do you go about choosing one utility model, one variation of the utility model that you want to?
Well, this is just fairly stock. This one is fairly stock standard in a sense. It just picks up on the random utility theory. So there's nothing particularly here in terms of picking. I mean, if you were saying, so in the risk world, you pick a functional form. So you might have, say you do prospect theory, you can have all different types of shapes of functions to capture the shape of effectively the way we think about choices in the gain and the loss domain. That's a functional form choice. It doesn't really come into it here in the same way. This is just, we basically all follow the standard, McFadden and Train approach, and effectively go from the logit, and then we sort of effectively have end with a sort of a linear expression. Yeah. I'm not sure I quite get what you're getting at though then, so maybe I've misinterpreted that.
No, it's okay.
You sure?
Chat later if you want.
Yeah, we're going to
Ben?
It's all right.
An important bit of information is that you filtered on the fact that people had actually bought the product in the last 6 months, because that's an important bit of information.
Yeah.
And then the discussions about, your design and thing. The design's okay now because people that hate fish, people that hate apples, fried apples, are excluded anyway.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, so with the fish finger one, we are not going to rule out. You don't have to buy them and eat them. You might buy them, and the people in your household might eat them. That's one thing. So we're not going to rule out you have to have bought it and eaten it. I always slightly worry about that as well, because I sort of think, that's not in a hypothetical setting. In a sense, you're not absolutely, and you're right. You might want them in your task because they might want to reject everything. I agree.
But that filters important context.
Yeah, I think it's also important because what it tells you is they've got prior experience of Apple buying of this dried apple type product, which then again means that you would expect them to have a lot less. They are probably more likely to be able to understand, at least have some understanding of what they think the attributes mean. Yeah, no, yeah, absolutely, I get it.
I've got a quickie.
Yeah.
So when we move away from sort of frequentist probabilities to just traditional risk type stuff, we get all confused. And that's reflected in the fact that there's multiple theories about how that works. So,
Yeah.
Min mentioned fuzzy logic, there's a whole literature.
Yeah.
You mentioned another one I hadn't heard of there, where that tree diagram. But there's also just decision theories, subjective expected utility decision theory, where your probabilities are subjective, but they're not really probabilities. They're more, as I sort of said earlier, they're just strength of feeling.
Yeah.
It seems to me that one thing you could try to do is just confront all that, because there's at least 3 versions of it, there might be more. Does yours relate to one of those better than the others? Does it resolve the differences between them? Does it highlight differences between them? This is huge, right? There's so much literature in those 3 areas, probably your one, but the other 2 there is.
Yeah.
But maybe there's something here that you could dig into more.
Yeah, I mean, there does seem to be at the moment, just generally in economics, and there seems to be a big sort of research agenda around the whole issue about uncertainty. So, the traditional macro world was Sims and, rational inattention. You're seeing it now in the micro theory where people are they're starting to want to reject some of the axioms of choice, and they're starting to think about the process behind choice, which again comes back to how we deal with the information, how we process it. This stuff is going on. But these literatures all do seem to be sort of, somewhat partitioned. Yeah, I think that probably will occur depending on who it gets put in front of. You could easily find if you put in front of somebody who's like just, a micro theorist, there's a whole tranche of stuff there which we sort of know about, and some of the references are in the paper, but we're not trying to fit it into it, but we try to say yes, we acknowledge and know about it. But yeah, I mean the fuzzy logic stuff I've read a bit about, but I wouldn't know how to sort of cross-reference it into this at the moment. But I think it's where the profession broadly defined seems to want to get into better understanding of uncertainty. And, this whole idea of, cognitive processing, and whether cognitive processing puts too much cost on us and then we don't bother, and then you end up in a world of heuristics and all of this stuff. This seems to be where lots of this world of choice making is going.
Economics.
Well, in some ways it is, but not wanting to just completely just go down the route of all becoming psychologists. Yeah.
Did you have your hand up again? I think it. Okay. Maybe one more quick question, if there is one. Gone.
No, good.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, Ian. Really
Thank you.